Hello, welcome to Global Eye. I am Parikshit Luthra. With less than 10 days to go for the G20 Leaders Summit, discussions on the communique have entered the final phase. Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be there at the G20, and Chinese President Xi Jinping may not come either. The Chinese side may be represented by Chinese Premier Li Qiang. Remember, Russia and China have together opposed any condemnation of the Ukraine-Russia war, and this is what has been holding back consensus on the communique from the start of India's presidency. So how will the absence of Putin and Xi impact India's G20 summit, and what is the most important agenda for the Indian government? To discuss that and more, we're now joined by Ambassador Rahul Chhabra, former Secretary Economic Relations at the Ministry of External Affairs, and also Ambassador Neelam, former diplomat and director at the Gateway House. Thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador Chhabra and Ambassador Deo. Ambassador Chhabra, let me begin by asking you, how do you think the absence of Putin and Xi will impact working of the G20 Leaders Summit, the consensus across different sessions?
Good evening, Parikshit. Thank you for having me on your show. Firstly, the absence will sort of affect the optics. It's not really going to affect the consensus, because the consensus building has been in position for the last several months, and we have sort of reached a consensus on virtually every aspect except the aspect that you mentioned. So except for that, there has been forward movement, progress, and consensus achieved thanks to our efforts. The presence of the two leaders would have helped in terms of, firstly, the bilaterals. There would have been very important bilaterals with several countries. And, of course, the sort of camaraderie, the bonhomie, the personal chemistry, that's all built up during the retreat, the informal interactions, the pull-asides that happen during summits like this. But otherwise, the hard work, the grunt work of building up the consensus is sort of already being done in the background. It's virtually reached its final stages by diplomats and ministers that have been working over the last several months. And of course, we will get a chair summary, or we'll get an outcome document. We will not get a joint communique.
Okay, we might not get a communique, we will get a chair summary for that matter, as we've seen with different meetings over the last few weeks. But Ambassador Deo, if I can come to you, we've got a statement from Sergei Lavrov. He has said to the Russian media that there will be no general declaration on behalf of all members if the Russian position is not reflected. Basically, Russia has said that they will block the declaration if their view is not taken forward. How do you see this statement, and what kind of a role can Russia play?
Well, I think it's quite clear he's making a statement about what has been happening throughout. We haven't had joint statements from the finance ministers or from the when the foreign ministers met. So basically, that's all that I would read into the statement. So there won't be a joint communique, but there will be the chairman's statement, and there will be all the important paragraphs reflecting agreements on all the issues that have been discussed for the past almost 1 year now, including such things as on finance, for instance, where we didn't have a joint statement, and the Russian and Chinese position is well known. I don't think there is much for them to reiterate at this point. So for the two presidents to stay away, it's a pity, and as my colleague says, there would have been important bilateral meetings for the Indian side, but also from their side with other heads of government. But perhaps they decided that they would have faced too much criticism to want to take it in their face, so to speak.
Right. Ambassador Chhabra, returning to you, when it comes to the role of China, and Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF chief, had earlier said that China has to be on the table when it comes to crucial decisions impacting the global economy, including debt restructuring, multilateral development bank reform as well for the future. When Xi Jinping is not there, yes, most of the groundwork on the communique, on the declaration or the chair summary, that's already been done. But do you think that China could throw a spanner in the works when it comes to a common framework on debt restructuring or, for that matter, on multilateral development bank reform or climate financing?
The fact that he's there or not there is really not the issue, because delegations, when they debate, and these things happen all in the background, they happen prior to the leaders' meeting. So when a leaders' meeting actually take place, they aren't actually sorting out issues like this face to face. And when the delegations are there, they're getting the instructions, the guidance from the leaders. So the leaders are fully in the picture of how things are moving. So if this was not going to take place or things were not going to evolve, it's not because he's not there. So that's just to make one procedural sort of point clear. Otherwise, I think there has been sort of forward movement in the issues you've mentioned. It may not have moved enough. The needle has not probably moved enough in terms of climate financing, multilateral debt funding. But there has been movement on all these fronts. So we just wait and see how much exactly when we get out the final chair's summary when it comes out.
Right. What would you be looking out for, Ambassador Deo? We will see at least 23 or 25 heads of state, heads of government there at the G20 from 8th to the 10th. What kind of atmosphere are we likely to see in the room? Do you expect the G7 to have its own meeting as well, Ambassador Deo?
Yeah, I think that in most of these meetings now, the small groupings do have their own consultations and meetings. So yes, likely the G7 will have a separate meeting since all their heads of government are going to be here. That will be quite important. But I think that is what happens in every G20 for the past couple of years. You know, in some ways, I think maybe, there are areas where the Chinese cannot obstruct. For instance, IMF restructuring. China is a very important voice, but it's still less than 6% of the vote. So if there is a restructuring agreed to by the other members of the IMF or the World Bank, that can proceed whether or not China and even Russia agree to it. So I don't think that the big concern for China and Russia is on these kinds of issues of climate change or financial or digital public infrastructures. Their concern is that, and they have been saying it repeatedly, that this is not the forum for political issues. That is, in a way, infructuous now. There isn't going to be an agreed communique. There will be a chairman's statement, and more in the chairman's statement also, it is clarified that some delegations did not agree to this wording or agree to that wording.
Right. All right. Ambassador Chhabra, returning to you, when it comes to India's key priorities, what is the one big thing that India would like to achieve in those 3 days, 8th, 9th and 10th, 9th and 10th being the substantive days?
If I may be permitted to just go back for a split second, to continue on Ambassador Deo's point, China generally does not like to be the last man standing. So that is their general position. So if there is consensus building up, they are not the ones who will sort of stand in the way in that sense. But coming to the question that you just raised, India's concern has always been in this summit to put across the one world, one earth, one family, that concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And in that context, the sub-theme has been to sort of play as the voice of the global south. So you remember that Prime Minister Modi had this summit where over 125 countries participated, though it was a virtual summit. And then even at the BRICS meeting, he had meetings with several bilateral meetings with many of the African countries, the other Asian countries who were present. So he got a good feel of what the global south wants, what is our desires. That is basically food, security, fuel, fertilizers, climate finance, circular economy, sustainable development. So India has been putting all these issues on the table, which has not been really done ever by the G20 before. And more than that, rather than just putting the issues on the table, they've also been putting out solutions to these. For example, in terms of food security, the International Year of Millets. So millets is a very, consume less water and is much more nutritional. In terms of climate change, the solar initiatives that you've taken. In terms of climate financing, the different types of options that are available. Carbon taxes, green bonds, catastrophe bonds, public-private partnerships. So you've got to be able to raise money, raise funding on all these ways. But also raising awareness, continue to raise awareness in the COP about what the developed world has committed and has not delivered yet, the $100 billion annual commitment that they have done for climate change.
Right. Ambassador Deo, my final question to you. Ukraine wanted President Zelensky to participate in G20. There were representations from the Ukraine government to have Zelensky be invited. India said that the list of invitations has already gone. It's all done with. We did not invite Zelensky. But do you think the G7, when it meets at their own level, could consider some sort of intervention, some sort of representation from Zelensky, from Ukraine, at least at the G7 level, to show solidarity?
The G7 has gone out of its way to commit itself to Ukraine. So I think they may do anything. I mean, all G7, European Union, NATO, all of these meetings now begin with declarations of undying fealty to Zelensky of Ukraine. I hope they won't do something that is disruptive and that takes away attention from all the things that have been agreed to and all the things that are actually in many ways more important, not only to the global south. For example, India has suggested that we invite the African Union to join the G20, the way the European Union is represented or the IMF, etc., are all participating. I think that's really important, given the fact that right now, Africa is top of the agenda for the United States, for China, certainly for India. It's been important for a while. So I do hope that the G7 will not do something to embarrass the host. And actually, I don't think they will. But could they? Yes, but they could only invite to one of their own gatherings, which they have been doing ceaselessly for the last year and a half.
Right. All right. Ambassador Deo, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Chhabra as well for joining us on this very interesting discussion, looking ahead to that mega G20 meeting that will take place in the national capital. Over 10,000 delegates expected, a huge challenge in terms of protocol, security and logistics for the Indian government. But they tell us they are prepared, 99%. We're going to take a short break on that note, but when we return, we will get you a conversation with Harshvardhan Shringla, the chief coordinator for India's G20 presidency, on the state of preparations, what to expect and India's core priorities.